There are seasons in a man's life when moving through the world feels less like living and more like crossing invisible borders. You become the kind of traveler who never carries the right documents, whose identity is always under review, whose sense of place depends on an unseen authority stamping approval on your existence. And without noticing, you begin to believe something that quietly shapes everything you do. If I can just be acceptable enough, maybe someone will let me stay. Most men never say this aloud, but their bodies say it for them. The shoulders that tighten in group settings, the careful smile that hides the tremor underneath, the way you replay conversations afterward like an immigration officer might call you back to the desk. You don't realize it, but this is the first unconscious mistake, confusing acceptance with safety, as if belonging were oxygen and exclusion were death. A man can live decades inside this confusion without knowing it has been writing his choices for him. There is a particular wound beneath this pattern, one many men carry quietly, the dread of being from nowhere. No inherited belonging, no masculine lineage that feels alive in the bones, no circle that reflects back a steady image of who you are. It leaves you moving through life without a center of gravity, like you're walking slightly above the ground. You adapt to every room, you match every tone, you shrink or expand depending on what seems required, but rarely do you feel yourself fully occupying your own shape. Jung might call this the orphan archetype, not because you lacked caregivers, but because your nervous system learned early that affection had to be earned. You became the boy who watched micro-expressions like weather signs, who learned to read subtle shifts in tone before others even sensed the mood had changed. Approval was shelter. Disapproval felt like exile. Belonging became a test with no instructions, and you carried that test into adulthood, still waiting to pass. When men speak about this, they often reach for technical metaphors. Upgrades, rewiring, resetting. But the truth is far more ancient. You are like a wandering torchbearer whose flame dims the moment he steps outside a circle of others. Your nervous system burns through fuel trying to stay lit, because belonging has become your oxygen rather than a shared warmth. You don't notice the exhaustion because the striving feels normal, almost noble, but the body keeps the score. It remembers every room where you felt tolerated rather than welcomed, and it prepares itself for the next one before you arrive. Modern neuroscience gives language to what your chest has known for years. Social exclusion activates the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. Not metaphorically, literally. The ache you feel when you sense distance, silence, or disapproval is not weakness. It is a wound your system has been carrying since the earliest inconsistencies in connection. As Dr. Gabor Mate would remind us, the body doesn't lie about what threatened it first. And because that wound burns so sharply, many men fall into a quiet survival strategy. They begin erasing themselves. You mute your instincts so you don't interrupt the group. You swallow your hunger so you don't appear demanding. You trade edges for acceptance, not because you lack strength, but because you fear exile more than you fear disappearing. This is how men stay too long in exploitative workplace cultures, in trauma bond dynamics, in charismatic micro-communities where approval is currency and self-abandonment becomes the cost of admission. Yet the deeper truth is rarely spoken. Belonging is essential, but when it becomes a throne you kneel before, your life bends around the wrong center. What a man longs for is not to escape relationships, but to stop outsourcing his access to them. There comes a day, not dramatic, not cinematic, when the need for belonging loses its crown. When you stand in a room and realize you are no longer asking permission to exist there. If you've ever felt like the world was a series of gates you had to earn your way through, stay with this journey. Because at the midpoint of this video, we uncover a pattern most men live inside without seeing it. A single pivot that turns, "I don't belong anywhere," from a life sentence into the beginning of a new kind of movement. One where you carry your own fire rather than pleading for a place near someone else's. Let's walk slowly into that. There is a moment in many men's lives when they begin to sense that their reactions around people feel older than they are. As if the body is following a script written long before adulthood. What feels like personality is often something much quieter, a loyalty contract, inherited before language, encoded in the nervous system, shaping how you move through every room. And here lies another unconscious misunderstanding most men never catch, believing they are choosing their behavior, when in truth, much of it is adapted memory. In childhood, approval becomes more than praise. For a boy who sensed inconsistency, tension, or emotional distance, approval becomes shelter, safety, predictability, a kind of passport into moments of warmth. And so the body learns a rule that outlives childhood. Authenticity risks loss, while adaptation keeps the peace. The adult man feels the consequences without ever connecting them to their origin. He walks into a meeting, into a date, into a circle of friends, and his nervous system scans for signs of exile before his mind even considers what he wants. You might notice this in the way you read a room, how you sense tone shifts instantly, how you adjust your voice by half a degree, how you position yourself in the safest part of a group conversation. The mind calls this social intelligence, but the body knows it differently. It is preemptive adaptation, an instinct designed not for thriving, but for avoiding punishment. When caregivers were unpredictable or overwhelmed, the child learned to shapeshift, not to connect, but to stay included. And the echoes of that learning follow you into adulthood even when no one is threatening you anymore. The pain of exclusion is not imagined. Neuroimaging studies show that social rejection activates neural regions involved in physical pain. The ache is real, and it explains why something as small as being left on read can feel disproportionately sharp. Your system registers it like an impact, not an insult. And in that moment, the old rule comes online again: belong or disappear. As Dr. Gabor Mate often reminds, the body protects attachment before it protects authenticity, because that is how the young survive. When belonging becomes tied to survival, every cluster of people gains an exaggerated importance. A group chat becomes a tribal council. A friend's silence feels like a warning. A colleague's distracted expression becomes evidence that you have fallen out of favor. The modern world offers small social cues, but your nervous system reacts as though the village might cast you out at dusk. And this invisible inflation shapes everything: decisions, emotional tone, even ambition. Over time, adaptation becomes less a strategy and more a container you live inside. Men who speak about never feeling like they fit anywhere often describe a life of shifting roles, being the quiet one in one room, the funny one in another, the responsible one somewhere else. The cost is that you remain present but unseen, included but not known. Role shifting keeps you near the circle, but never truly inside it. And because you are performing a version of yourself, the warmth you receive never fully sinks in. It is given to the mask, not to the man. There is an additional layer that often goes unspoken. People who are highly adaptive often attract those who benefit from that flexibility. Approval becomes a kind of currency, offered selectively by individuals who understand, consciously or not, that you will bend to keep the bond. This is how manipulators find their foothold, not through force, but through the unhealed belief that belonging must be earned. It is not a flaw in intelligence. It is a vulnerability created by early inconsistency. Jung might say the orphan archetype slips into the role of the slave when fear of exile becomes stronger than the need for selfhood. If you look closely, you may recognize signals that you have been performing a self rather than inhabiting one, rehearsing conversations beforehand, feeling more dread before a group meeting than before an actual high-stakes moment, tolerating subtle disrespect because losing access to the circle feels worse than the discomfort itself. These are not failures. They are adaptations whose time has passed. Every man who carries the orphan imprint must eventually ask a difficult question: were the people around me holding me or merely tolerating me? And here is the subtle turn that begins to shift everything. When belonging is treated as survival, the psyche reaches for its lowest cost substitute: digital approval, instant signals of inclusion, small hits of recognition that imitate connection but never nourish it. Before we explore the modern traps built around this hunger, notice the bridge forming. A man who feels unseen in the physical world is far more vulnerable to the illusions of connection offered by the digital one. We move there next, not to judge the pattern, but to understand the hunger beneath it. There is a point in this journey where the pursuit of belonging shifts terrains. When real-world circles feel unpredictable or draining, the psyche begins migrating to a domain where the cost of entry is lower, the risk of rejection feels muted, and the signals of inclusion arrive instantly. The modern man often believes he is simply scrolling, posting, or checking in, but something far more primal is happening beneath the surface. The nervous system is outsourcing its need for recognition to digital environments that promise connection but deliver stimulation. In the physical world, belonging carries weight. Your tone matters, your body matters, timing matters. But online, the feedback is clean, instantaneous, and seemingly safe. A notification offers the illusion of being seen without the vulnerability of presence. What most men don't initially realize is that this shift is not laziness or avoidance. It is adaptation. When belonging feels tied to survival and survival feels exhausting, the mind chooses the path where the stakes seem lower. And in that unconscious choice lies another misunderstanding. Believing these micro-validations constitute connection, when they are merely echoes of it. The digital sphere becomes a mirror that never argues. Algorithms reflect back what creates engagement, not what reflects truth. Over time, your identity begins bending toward what generates a response, not what expresses who you are. This happens gradually, almost poetically. Like a riverbank reshaped by a current it no longer notices. Micro-validation offers a kind of intoxication, a brief lift, a quick spark, a small sense of mattering. Yet the lift fades faster than it arrives, and the crash leaves the hunger sharper than before. Neuroscience explains why. Each small burst of online approval activates reward circuitry in regions like the nucleus accumbens, the same circuits that respond to anticipation, novelty, and reward seeking. It is not the size of the approval that captures you. It is the variable timing, the unpredictability, the slight possibility that the next post, the next message, the next ping will finally deliver the feeling of belonging you have been chasing since childhood. The nervous system becomes trained to seek the hit, not the relationship. You are not drawn to the screen itself. You are drawn to the fantasy that somewhere out there, a faceless group, might confirm your significance. This creates a loop that feels harmless, but slowly rewires your emotional economy. A moment of posting, the anticipation while waiting, the small reward, the sudden drop, then the return. Each cycle reinforces the idea that the next interaction might resolve the ache. Yet platforms are not designed to satisfy the longing. They are designed to sustain it. Stable identity is not profitable. A man who knows who he is cannot be shaped by algorithms. So the systems invite you into a subtle hall of mirrored lanterns, reflections everywhere, illumination nowhere. You walk through believing you are gathering light, when in truth you are gathering images of yourself refracted through other people's attention spans. Signs of this subtle drift often show up quietly. The anxiety after scrolling is heavier than the tension you felt before you picked up the device. Real conversations begin to feel riskier because they allow no editing, no delay, no controlled presentation. You notice that the persona you curate online is becoming more polished, more strategic, more performative than the self you carry in silence. And when these pieces accumulate, authenticity begins to feel like exposure, as though being unfiltered might cost you the small, predictable hits of reassurance you have grown accustomed to. It is worth pausing here, not to criticize the pattern but to acknowledge its intelligence. The digital world offered itself as a low-risk refuge when your inner world and outer relationships felt volatile. It became a surrogate tribe when the real tribes felt too sharp, too inconsistent, or too small. Yet the truth beneath the pattern remains. A man cannot live on signals alone. Signals mimic connection, but they do not metabolize into belonging. They cannot hold your grief, challenge your shadow, or meet the parts of you that have never been mirrored accurately. And so, when the intoxication begins to dull, a deeper realization emerges. The same one many men reach in quiet moments after long nights of scrolling or after a particularly empty burst of online interaction. No system, no group, no digital constellation can carry a man who has not yet built his own internal ground. Before the midpoint of this journey, a sentence often surfaces that many men instinctively resist, but eventually recognize as true. The world is not withholding belonging from you. It is waiting for you to anchor into a self that cannot be outsourced. From here, the movement shifts inward. Something begins to crack. The old strategies, the personas, the external scaffolding, and that cracking is not collapse, but invitation. We step into that shift next. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when the strategies that once kept you safe begin to feel impossibly small. You notice it in conversations where you suddenly hear yourself speaking as though from a distance, performing a role that no longer fits. You notice it in rooms where your presence feels compressed, as though you are folding parts of yourself to avoid taking up too much space. What many men misinterpret here is believing they are becoming difficult, too intense, too principled, or too inconvenient. But something else is happening underneath. The self is outgrowing the container that once protected it. Men on forums and in late-night confessions often describe this sensation as being misplaced. They assume it reveals a defect, some flaw that keeps them from integrating smoothly into the world. Yet when you look through a Jungian lens, this discomfort signals the opposite. It is not a failure of belonging, but the beginning of individuation. The psyche is shedding the borrowed shapes it once used for survival. The tension you feel is the friction between an old identity and a newer, more sovereign one. This is the moment the outsider archetype begins to transform. The question shifts from "where do I fit?" to "why have I been bending myself at all?" Belonging no longer appears as the highest good. It becomes one value among many, one influence among several. When a man begins asking these deeper questions, it is often because his internal map is shifting from survival to integrity. The need to be accepted begins to feel lighter than the need to be honest with himself. Self-determination theory speaks here with clarity. Human well-being rests on three pillars: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When any circle, social, professional, spiritual, asks you to sacrifice autonomy or competence in exchange for belonging, the cost becomes spiritual shrinkage. You sense it first as irritation, then as fatigue, then as a subtle grief. Your body knows before your mind does. Belonging that requires self-betrayal isn't belonging. It is a gilded cage lined with emotional velvet. Across cultures, collectives can support identity beautifully when dignity remains intact. But any environment, no matter how warm on the surface, becomes harmful when conformity replaces respect. A man begins to feel this when his insights are softened to avoid tension, when his growth triggers unspoken guilt, when he senses he must stay smaller than he actually is to keep the peace. The psyche reads this as a betrayal of its own evolution. It remembers something the conscious mind forgets. No tribe is worth the price of abandoning oneself. Mythology offers an image here: the warrior who leaves his village for initiation and returns bearing a new depth, only to find the village prefers the earlier, simpler version of him. They pressure him to forget what he learned so everyone can remain comfortable. His obedience becomes their stability, but his internal world contracts with every concession. That myth is not dramatic. It is painfully ordinary. Many men live this silently every day. The signals of this collapse are subtle, but unmistakable. Growth begins to produce guilt, as though rising in clarity or strength violates an unspoken contract. Your values start shifting faster than the circle around you can adapt, so you find yourself adjusting downward to avoid dissonance. The parts of you that want more depth, more truth, more accountability, go underground because you sense they will not land well. Over time, a shadow trade occurs. Being included replaces being fully alive. Yet this collapse is not a failure. It is the hinge. It is the moment when you see that no group, no matter how loving, can substitute for an inner axis. And once you recognize this, a new task emerges, not to find the perfect circle, but to build an internal structure capable of standing beside any circle as an equal, not a petitioner. This is where the path shifts. In the next movement, we explore what that internal structure looks like, and how men quietly begin constructing an inner republic that frees them from needing permission to exist. There is a shift that happens so quietly, a man might miss it if he is not paying attention. It begins with a single, almost imperceptible question rising somewhere in the chest. Not, will they accept me? But, does my presence here honor the man I'm becoming? That question marks the end of the petitioner and the beginning of something steadier, something older, something resembling sovereignty. It is not defiance. It is alignment, a turning of loyalty from approval toward integrity. Within Jung's architecture, this is the moment when the boy in the hallway yields to the emergence of the inner king. Not a king who rules over others, but one who holds the center of his own inner territory. His allegiance shifts from external reassurance to internal coherence. And when this happens, the leverage others once held begins to dissolve. Manipulators lose their foothold not because you resist them harder, but because the source of your oxygen has changed. You no longer breathe through their validation. A man often discovers this transformation through small, ordinary moments rather than grand declarations. It might look like revealing 1 shade more truth than you usually allow, 10% more clarity in a conversation, 10% more honesty in a boundary, 10% more transparency in a preference, not as a performance, but as an experiment in being less divided. What follows is rarely dramatic, but it is revealing. Some people expand with your honesty, others tighten. Some grow curious, others grow reactive. These reactions don't define your worth, they map your relational landscape. This mapping becomes a quiet compass. You begin to see who relates to your essence and who relates only to your compliance. You notice how certain dynamics relied on your self-suppression and how fragile they become when you stop dimming. The more you hold steady, the clearer the pattern becomes. Relationships that once felt stable were actually balanced on your silence. There is no judgment in this recognition. It is simply the truth emerging after years of adaptation. Something powerful happens in the nervous system during this stage. Each time you hold a small truth without abandoning yourself, the body learns a lesson it was denied earlier in life. Honesty is survivable. Autonomy is not exile. Being real does not automatically lead to abandonment. Over repeated moments, circuits that once associated authenticity with danger begin to update. As Dr. Gabor Mate might reflect, the body learns safety at the pace of experience, not theory. And with each grounded act of clarity, the old alarm system loosens its grip. This inner restructuring creates a different kind of strength, not rigid, not performative, but quietly anchored. You begin to sense your life less as a single empire that demands devotion and more as a federation of domains. Work, friendship, purpose, intimacy, spirituality. Each has its own needs, its own agreements, its own rhythms, and none of them receives sovereignty over your core. When one area destabilizes, it no longer collapses the entire structure. You negotiate with each domain rather than surrendering yourself to any of them. This is the inner republic, a place where autonomy, competence, and relatedness coexist without requiring you to contort yourself. A place where belonging becomes a dialogue, not a transaction. A place where your sense of self is no longer outsourced to the mood of the room. And once this inner architecture stabilizes, something profound emerges. You stop walking into groups as a man hoping to be chosen, and begin walking into them as a man who already carries his own ground. From here, the path widens. You begin moving through the world differently, not as someone from nowhere, but as someone who can move anywhere without losing shape. This sets the stage for a deeper revelation, one that reframes the outsider not as a wound, but as a form of wisdom. That is where we go next. There comes a stage, often after the inner republic begins forming, when something unexpected appears in the background of your life. It isn't confidence, and it isn't detachment. It is a quiet capacity to move through groups without shrinking or inflating. A sense that you are no longer trying to merge with the room, but also no longer trying to prove you don't need it. This paradox sits at the heart of the mature outsider, a man who does not belong everywhere, yet can walk anywhere. Many men describe this as feeling unfixed, as though they drift between worlds without fully settling into any of them. For years, they interpret this as a flaw. They tell themselves they are too different, too reflective, too sensitive, too slow to trust, too unwilling to perform the social rituals that seem to come naturally to others. But when viewed through a deeper psychological lens, this unfixed quality reveals something else: permeability, a perceptive mind that notices patterns insiders overlook, a sensitivity that becomes a form of intelligence once it is no longer burdened by shame. Jung might align this with the wanderer or Hermes archetype, a figure who moves between realms, translating between them rather than belonging exclusively to one. Not rootless, but mobile. Not detached, but discerning. A man who does not stay where he cannot bring his full weather with him. This mobility is not avoidance, it is integrity. And when the need for permission dissolves, the ability to travel between worlds becomes a kind of strength. The shame tied to being an outsider begins to loosen as well. What once felt like oversensitivity starts to feel like attunement. What once felt like fragility begins to feel like depth. You start noticing that you see dynamics others are too entangled to perceive. Power games, subtle manipulations, unspoken agreements, the emotional climate of a room before anyone acknowledges it. Outsiders often become the first to sense when something is off, not because they are anxious, but because they never fully swallowed the group's mythology. They are observers by design, and observation becomes a form of protection. There is a turning point in many men's stories where they stop diluting themselves to remain palatable. They redirect their energy toward depth rather than approval, toward fewer relationships but richer ones, toward conversations that feel like ground rather than noise. And without forcing anything, the traits that once seemed inconvenient begin to attract contexts where they are not merely tolerated, but valued. Steadiness becomes leadership. Discernment becomes guidance. Sensitivity becomes signal intelligence rather than emotional liability. This is not isolation. It is curation. You begin to choose the circles you enter rather than orbiting any circle that will have you. Your presence becomes intentional. The rooms you leave no longer spark guilt. The disagreements you feel no longer trigger exile panic. Loyalty shifts from applause to alignment. You are not withdrawing from the world. You are navigating it with a different compass. These shifts signal something profound. The need for universal belonging fades, and a more grounded form of presence takes its place. A presence shaped not by hunger, but by clarity. Not by the fear of being overlooked, but by the recognition that your depth does not require universal recognition to be real. This threshold is subtle, and very few cross it consciously. Most men drift into resignation. But the man who walks with his own weather discovers that he is not from nowhere. He is from the ground he stands on, and the ground travels with him. From here, we move toward the closing arc. What it means to carry your own fire, and how belonging transforms when it becomes a choice rather than a cage. There is a moment near the end of this journey when the landscape of your inner life becomes clearer than it has ever been. Not because every question is answered, but because something fundamental has shifted in how you stand. You no longer move through the world like a wanderer pleading at doorsteps, waiting for someone to grant you a place inside their circle. You move like a man carrying his own fire, a man who brings warmth with him, rather than waiting to be warmed. This fire is not confidence or bravado. It is not self-sufficiency in the hardened sense. It is something quieter and more durable, the recognition that your center of gravity no longer lives outside your body. Belonging is no longer the throne you kneel before, the prize you try to earn, or the measure you use to decide your worth. It becomes a choice, one that aligns with your values, your integrity, your internal republic. To integrate the arc we've walked, imagine all the layers we've touched converging into one coherent thread. The orphan's survival-driven belonging that taught you to read every room like a threat. The nervous system's ancient pain scripts that shaped your instinct to adapt, to shrink, to scan for danger even when no danger was present. The collapse of circles that once felt essential but could no longer contain the man emerging beneath the surface. And finally, the construction of an inner structure capable of holding your truth without apology. Each phase revealed parts of the shadow that had been living unacknowledged. Your sensitivity, your hunger for connection, your longing for recognition, your fear of exile. None of these traits were signs of weakness. They were signposts pointing toward integration. And now, in this closing movement, another truth becomes visible. The very sensitivity that once made you feel exposed is the same intelligence that now allows you to sense alignment, sincerity, and power games with uncommon clarity. This evolution brings a different quality into your relationships. You no longer abandon yourself to avoid rupture. You no longer confuse acceptance with safety. You no longer pursue circles that cannot meet you where you stand. Not because you are detached, but because your loyalty has relocated. It now belongs to your path, to the man you are shaping, to the values that form the spine of your life. You do not renounce relationships. You simply stop outsourcing your center of gravity to them. And from that posture, belonging becomes spacious. It becomes reciprocal rather than performative. You can enter a circle without needing it to complete you, and you can leave one without feeling diminished. You carry your own weather, your own rhythm, your own flame. As we close, there is one gentle invitation often offered to men at this stage, not as instruction, but as a way of honoring the journey you've taken inside yourself. If this story has mapped your experience in any way, consider recalling the first moment in your life when you sensed you didn't belong. Not to judge it, not to fix it, but to recognize how long you've been carrying questions you never had language for. Sometimes speaking a single sentence from that memory becomes a lantern for another man walking the same terrain. If you choose to share it, offer only one line, one moment, one image. It may become the signal someone else needs to begin their own journey toward carrying their fire, rather than searching endlessly for someone else's flame.